Okay, so let's finish up chapter 1 now, and let's take a look at Paul's shocking story because he shares his story. Starting in verse 11, he says this, "I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up." Now we see this theme again, the gospel. He's talking about the importance of the true gospel. Okay, so he says, "I didn't make this up." In verse 12, he says, "I didn't receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but rather I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ." It's important to note this. He's trying to establish his credibility, and that's why he's telling this story. Now we see Acts chapter 9, and we're going to get there in just a minute. That's where we see his story, his conversion story. We'll get there in just a second. Let's go back to Galatians 1 in verse 13. "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, and how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it." He says, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers." Let's go to Acts chapter 9 now and see the story told from the author of Acts. And here's how the story of Saul was told there. Acts 9:1 says this, Paul's name was Saul before he came to Christ. So it says this, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest, and he asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way was what the Christians were called at that point in time, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem." So this is what he's talking about when he's saying that he was extremely zealous for the traditions of his fathers. He didn't think that this little Christian sect of Judaism was right, and he was zealously persecuting anyone who was preaching the name of Jesus. But back to Galatians chapter 1 now, in verse 15, Paul describes what happened to him. He says, "But God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace." Now there's that word grace. We're going to see that there's several themes here. We've got the theme of gospel. We've got the theme of freedom, and we've got the theme of Jesus' rescue of us, and then this theme of grace. He says, "God called me by his grace, and he was pleased to reveal his son in me." Let's go back to Acts chapter 9 and see the story from Luke's point of view, the author of Acts. He writes this, as Saul neared Damascus on his journey, remember, this was the journey to go persecute Christians. It says, "Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground. He heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?'" Now, Saul didn't know who this voice was. Saul didn't know who this vision was coming from. But we see it in verse 5. Saul says, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice responded, "I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now that must have been a shocker to Saul, because he was just persecuting Jesus and all of Jesus' followers because he thought Jesus was a phony. And here Jesus is appearing to him in this vision. And Jesus says to him in verse 6, "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." See, God shocked Saul with the truth that he was on the wrong team all along. And in Acts chapter 9 here, we see the beginning of Saul's conversion experience and this turnaround experience. You can go back and read chapter 9 to learn more about this experience, and Paul's going to explain more of it in Galatians as we go through these next few videos. But here's the point. For right now, I want to make sure you understand the point. Paul tells his story to establish that even though he wasn't one of the original disciples of Christ, Peter, James, John, those guys, he was still an apostle. See, Paul has to establish his credibility because I'm sure the Judaizers were coming through Galatia right after Paul came through and shared the gospel with them. And they were probably saying, "This Paul guy isn't even an apostle. He didn't even walk with Jesus. Why would you listen to him? We have the truth. He doesn't." But see, Paul has to establish his credibility to make sure that they know that Jesus did appear to him, that Jesus spoke to him, that Jesus revealed the true gospel to Saul and took him off of the course that he was going on, which was the course of legalism and Judaism and following the law to try to be righteous, which no one can do. And he put him on the course of understanding that we're saved by grace. And so this is what we're going to see in these next few chapters. And so it's important for us to understand this term apostle, because Paul is an apostle. Paul is saying, "I am called by God and I'm an apostle." And let's go back to verse 1 now in Galatians 1, because this has new meaning now. The way Paul starts this whole letter off, he says this, "Paul, an apostle, sent not from men nor by man." Do you understand now in the context of his story what he's talking about? He says, "But I was sent by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead." It's really awesome to understand that in the context now of Paul's story. So for right now, to finish up today's lesson, why don't you just hit pause as a group, talk about this. Why do you think God chose Paul to be such a key player in the early church? I mean, given his story, most of the disciples were fishermen, but Paul is a guy who was high up in the Jewish faith and the Jewish church, who's very educated. Why would God choose someone like that? And what can we learn from it? Why don't you talk about that? Make sure to read Acts chapter 9. In fact, I'd encourage you to read Acts chapters 9 through 15 before next week, because we'll talk more about that as we get into Galatians 2, and we'll see you in that video.